Hello, welcome to the Thinkers50 Radar 2021 series, brought to you with LinkedIn Live. I'm Stuart Craner.
And I'm Des Dearlove, and we're the founders of Thinkers50, the world's most reliable resource for identifying, ranking and sharing the leading management ideas of our age, ideas that can make a real difference in the world.
Our belief in the power of ideas has been the foundation of our work since we launched the first ever global ranking of management thinkers in 2001. We've published a new Thinkers50 ranking every 2 years since, and it remains the premier ranking of its kind.
So we're excited that 2021, a year in which fresh thinking and human ingenuity are more important than ever, is also a Thinkers50 year.
Nominations are now open for both the ranking of management thinkers and the Distinguished Achievement Awards, which the Financial Times very perceptively calls the Oscars of management thinking.
Shortlists for the Thinkers50 Awards will be announced during the summer, and then the year's finale on the 15th and 16th of November will bring all the excitement of a new ranking and the naming of our Thinkers50 2021 award winners.
In this series of 30-minute webinars, we want to showcase some of the freshest and most interesting ideas and to bring you the new voices of management thinking.
We want to inspire you to seize this moment to create a better future for you and your organization.
Our guest today will certainly help along the way. His name is Dashun Wang, an Associate Professor of Management and Organizations at the Kellogg School of Management, where he is the founding director of the Center for the Science of Science and Innovation. He's also a core faculty member at the Northwestern Institute on Complex Systems.
Dashun's current research focuses on the science of science, a quest to turn scientific methods and curiosities upon ourselves. His research hopes to use and develop tools from complexity sciences and artificial intelligence to explore the opportunities for innovation and promises of prosperity offered by the data explosion in science. His first book, The Science of Science, is now available.
Dashun, welcome and thank you for joining us. I think now's the time to plug the Science of Science book. You can hold it up to the camera.
Thank you so much. Now it's a shameless but obligatory plug. The book is now available on Amazon. If you want to order a physical copy, pick the paperback, which is just as good as the hard copy, but much, much cheaper. At the same time, I'm also excited to say part of the open science movement is I'm also excited to be releasing the book, the PDF version, freely available online in the next few weeks. So if you don't want to order the book, trace me on my website, and hopefully the book will be available soon, free to everybody to read.
Yeah, that sounds a really great innovation. So what's going to happen today is our usual format. We're going to hand over to Dashun, who's going to talk for 10 minutes or so, and then we're going to have a discussion about his ideas and the science of science after that. So Dashun, the virtual stage is yours.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I thought, today I'm a recovering physicist in a business school. And I thought, given the 15 minutes that we have today, first of all, is to show you some of the new thinkings we have around failures and its relationship to success. And then sort of my goal in the first, part of the presentation is to present some of the new data that we have. And hopefully that helps anchor some of the discussions, following the presentation. So truth be told, I started my career trying to understand success and trying to look at these people, ideas, organizations, and their achievements, and trying to understand the patterns behind them. And then as I studied them for about 5 to 6 years, and many of my colleagues also joined me in that venture, I started to realize a big flaw in this thinking. That is, what we're really ignoring is the many failures that are also happening at the same time. So in many ways, that's why about a couple of years ago, I told my group member that, I'm actually now going to study failure rather than success. And for about 3 months, nobody believed me that I was serious. So I think the overall thinking here is very simple, is to think about, while we may have succeeded in understanding success, we have failed to really understand failures. So after a couple of years now, I'm happy to report that we have now gathered several different kind of new data and built several different kinds of new theoretical frameworks that have broadly improved our understanding of failure on several dimensions. For the interest of time today, I'm going to present some data from Join's 3 different papers, including papers published in Nature and Nature Communications, as well as working papers has yet to be published, to try to show you some data that improve our thinkings around 2 dimensions of failures in particular. First is to think about the consequence of failures. Do failures matter? What's the consequence of early failure on long-term career outcomes? And second is to think about, are there impending signals in failures that eventually lead to success? Are there things we can learn from failures that can help us succeed sooner? What are they and how? So first, I want to turn sort of the consequence of failure. How big a difference does a failure make in your career? And so here I want to focus on a specific kind of failure that has fascinated me for a long time, namely near miss. Near miss is kind of failures, almost, but it didn't quite make it. So this happens all the time in sports as well as in every other domain. So the question I want to ask is, if you had an early career near miss, how big a difference in the future does it make? The opportunity came when NIH came to me and sort of offered me their data sets that records over 700,000 competing grant applications, sort of including both funded and unfunded applications. In this case, NIH is the largest funder for biomedical research in the world, and it supports, with an annual budget now close to $40 billion. And in this case, NIH is the ideal example for us to really study failure. So excellent setting in the sense that the way NIH ranks their grant proposals is by through peer review panels. That's each proposal is graded by a certain score, and then NIH basically sorts these grant proposals and fund them one by one until one point they run out of money. So that creates this arbitrary cutoff, sort of what they call pay line, where it separates out this 2 very interesting population of junior PIs. Here I'm focusing on junior professors, like think about people starting out their life within the past 3 years. And in this case, this is what economists call the identical twins between narrow winners and near misses. Before that day, both of them basically are identical people in both observable and unobservable ways. But after that day, there's a big difference between the two. Narrow winners now have $1 million for the next 5 years to conduct the research that they proposed. Near misses at that point had nothing. So, I want to think about then many years later, when imagine this 2 group of people come back for a job interview, who do you hire? So in this case, the answer appears to be quite simple. We want to think about, even though they were the same people, this lucky event tilt the scale where one succeeded when the other one didn't. So we should hire the one who succeeded, because we know rich gets richer, success begets success, and winning begets more winnings. But in this case, we just wanted to look at the data, and let's just examine for the 2 group of people over the next 10 years, out of the papers they published, how good are these papers? So we studied them, traced their publications, and here we're going to measure the impact of a paper using the ISO standard measurements in the field of science called hit paper probability. It measures, out of all the papers you published, what's the fraction of them become a hit paper in your field and year, defined as top 5 percentile citations in the same field and year. What we see is that narrow winners in the next 5 years publish hit papers at 13%, much, much higher than the baseline 5% rate. So this sort of is consistent is to show a competitive process at NIH. Being a narrow winner at NIH is not a walk in the park. So these people are substantially better than the same people in their field. But when we look at near misses, we see they publish the hit paper in the next 5 years at 16%. If we look at their papers in the next 5 years, from year 6 to 10, we see basically a similar scale. So what we see here is that paradoxically, somehow near misses systematically outperform narrow wins in the future. When we find this finding, and I was like, this can't be right, there must be something wrong. So we vary the measurements across all sorts of measurements we can think of, but every time we measure it from the data, we arrive at the same conclusion. Interestingly, if you look at the number of papers these 2 groups have published, you see they published a similar number of papers. So what this means is that near misses had fewer initial grants by design, yet they ultimately published as many papers, and most surprisingly, they produced work that garnered a substantially higher impact. So a natural question at this point is, what is going on here? And sort of a common hypothesis is called a screening hypothesis. So it goes where something like this, is that early career failure is actually of consequence. So when that happens, it differentially removed people from two sides of the aisle. So in this case, then raise the question of this idea of quit versus grit, is to say, well, is it just a better half of the population left? Or this is actually, they become a better version of themselves. One contribution of this work we did was to be able to move beyond this hypothesis to show that this screening hypothesis, while may account for some of the relationship, is not sufficient to explain what we observed here. So, yeah, so as a whole, then this actually offers among the first empirical evidence consistent with Nietzsche's classic phrase of "what doesn't kill you makes you stronger." Overall, this is sort of trying to show that, while the traditional wisdom of winners become more, winning begets more winnings, it seems like the story is more complex than that. So before I actually sort of get too excited about this, let me show you another domain of data, sort of try to help us think about this. Because if this is true, then it must be also true for other domains. So let's think about a domain that we're familiar with. Think about these winners, all winners standing on a podium, accepting their Olympics medals after years of training, right? So this is a familiar picture, but what I want to bring your attention is to think about the losers that are not in this picture. In other words, let me just subtract this with this abstract view of all these winners that we're familiar with. But for everybody, 3 people standing on the podium, there's always a number 4 that is, we cared so little about. And this is really interesting because I was trying to find a picture of the number 4 online, but I couldn't really find it. Instead, I find so many pictures about the award ceremony everywhere. So, but this does raise a very interesting question, is that given in this case, bronze medalists objectively outperformed the first place counterparts, then, if I compare these 2 people in the future, who will perform better in the future? Okay, so then that prompted me and my postdoc, Suman Mahdi, along with other collaborators, to collect systematically all the data about Olympics and world-class competitions. And here we focus on young athletes, again, below the age of 21, and we categorize them based on their ranking in their initial competition final. I don't want to just compare their future performance. If we just look at the winners, namely gold, silver, bronze medalists, we see a familiar pattern. That is, if I look at people who started as a gold medalist, how many medals do you win in the next 4 years? What we see is the familiar pattern that the past winners expected to be a bigger future winner. Just knowing your starting point yields substantial predictive power for how well you will do in the future. So if we look at the number 5 and number 6 in this case, we see they're similar, sort of follow a similar trend. So it's almost as if these curves follow a certain trend, except when I look at number 4, it seems to actually jump out of the pack. In other words, number 4 seems to be achieving more than we would expect otherwise. One explanation for this is to say, well, maybe you didn't make the podium at the previous competition, then you selectively go to less competitive competitions in the next rounds. So what we wanted to look at next is to say, why don't we pick 2 people in one competition and look, when they meet again on the same starting line, run head-to-head with each other, who performs better? So when we do that, when we look at the number 1 and number 2, gold versus silver, we see gold medal as more likely to win in the future. We look at number 2 and number 3, we see the same pattern. If we look at a number 5, number 6, or number 4 and number 5, we're seeing the same pattern. Past winners more likely to be future winners. But except between numbers 3 and number 4, where we see a reversal of performance, where number 4, the first place finishers, are more likely to upset their bronze medal counterparts. Here is interesting and surprising results I want to leave you with for this part of the presentation, is to think about extraordinary performance. If I take these people who start at certain rank, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, who are more likely to break a record in terms of world record, Olympic record, or championship record? What we see is that, the first group, top group, is the gold medalist. But what's really interesting is that the second group is neither the silver medal or the bronze medalist, but the fourth place finishers. So the initial fourth place finishers seems to be the second most likely group for record-breaking performance. And once you have this data, then it's easy to cherry pick on some examples. For example, a famous example would be Asaba Powell, who is a very, very famous sprinter. He set 100 meters world record twice. Over the years, many gold medal, silver medal, bronze medal performance. But what's interesting is that when he first started his career, he had AB punch on the number fours. He actually placed the fourth in both 100 and 200 meter sprint. So overall, these findings begin to establish failure as a counterintuitive predictor for future success. And overall, it shows that for those who persevere, early failure should not be taken as a negative signal, but perhaps rather the opposite. So hopefully this, first of all, give you some optimistic picture to think about, when you have setback. What's interesting about failure is that no one's immune to it. So when that occurs, hopefully this will not be your first reaction anymore, and rather you will think about something like around these lines. And remember that for innovators and managers, it's important to keep in mind that winners misclassified as losers today could end up being the bigger winner tomorrow. So in the next 2 minutes, let me show you another research to think about, if failure success happens all the time, can we learn from past failures and lead to success? Okay, so here I'm quoting Michael Jordan's famous saying is, I've failed over and over again in my life, and that's why I succeed. So the reality is that only some history of failures lead to success. So which failure patterns ultimately yield results? Conventional wisdom here centers around luck or differences between winners and losers because of their learning strategies or individual characteristics. But our research published in Nature shows that this is not so simple. In particular, here we study failures across 3 different domains in terms of NIH investigators trying to apply for a grant and then failed, and then try again, failed, and eventually land that grant. Or single entrepreneurs found a startup and failed, found another startup, failed, and eventually found a startup that succeeded or not. Or here, we also look at a very unconventional domain of research where we look at the terrorist organizations. In this case, we look at the terrorist attacks that launch attack, terrorist groups launch attack, didn't kill anyone, didn't claim any casualty, and launch another attack eventually as they move towards the lethal attacks. So across all these 3 domains, we want to build a simple but general framework to capture this. And the way we want to think about this is to think about a model of how successive attempts build on one another. So the key to this model is to view failure as a wonderful thing that offers 2 crucial assets. That is, first, it offers experience, and second, it offers you some feedback. So imagine each attempt includes multiple components. Like business startup requires a viable idea, revenue model, operational practices, or leadership teams, and others. So failure in this domain, then sort of not achieving an IPO, to help us understand so whether we should reuse certain components, for example, sticking with the same team or the same revenue model, and sort of take the past failure as a feedback to think about how do we initiate another attempt. So once we assume this model, and the model makes a rather surprising prediction, is to show that how much we benefit from failure actually doesn't follow a smooth path, but a very abrupt one characterized by tipping points that separate stagnation and successful region. Very much similar to the physical transition for water in the phase transition sense. So in the stagnation region, people learn very little from past failures. Think about entrepreneurs learning only from the most recent startups while ignoring all previous failures. So those in this region hit an early stagnation point, failing to engage in intelligent improvement. In many cases, they threw out prior attempts altogether, though some attempts may have been on target and advantageous. So this stagnation region is similar to water's physical phase of ice. Think about when you go temperature going from minus 40 degrees Celsius to minus 10 degrees, ice remains solid. But then if you learn just a few more failures, you quickly transition, sort of lead one past the tipping point. Now you're entering the regime of progression and success. So in this case, innovators use feedback to engage in intelligence improvement, yield incrementally better attempts, and ultimately to victory. So those who eventually succeed fail much faster and increasingly faster with each attempt, reusing previous components, and rather discarding the baby with the bathwater as your stagnant peers do. So very importantly, then this concept of tipping point suggests that small changes can make a big difference. So in this model, if we think about people are along this critical point, they may be very similar in their luck or learning styles or productivity, but just like water going from -1 degree to +1 degree, the temperature difference may be negligible, but the reality is very, very different. One may be successful and another maybe keep trying, but not seeing a light of the tunnel. So despite the simplicity of the model and the diversity in the domains we studied, we find that people across different fields, terrorists, entrepreneurs, or scientists, predictably diverge into success and stagnation groups described here. Although both groups are of similar size and initial characteristics from the beginning. So the tipping point, the idea of tipping point tells us that even in the absence of distinguishing characteristics, individuals and organizations may experience fundamentally different outcomes. The two groups may follow fundamentally different temporal patterns that are distinguishable at a very early stage. So taken together, Thomas Edison, who is probably the most famous one to fail many, many times, had this phrase of many of life's failures of people who didn't realize how close they were to success when they gave up. So hopefully this will help us understand better and gauge how close we are to success as we fail over and over. Thank you so much. It's so great to share at least one direction of the overall research agenda around science of science, to think about how do we use the new data and different computational methods to better understand issues around innovation and science. Feel free to check out my website for more other related work as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dashun. Let us have any questions. People have joined us from throughout the world. Good to see everybody here. What a fascinating subject. It's amazing it's so neglected and we're so obsessed with success. Dashun, a kind of practical question. What does this mean for organizations in their hiring in particular? Because from what you're saying, they should be hiring people who have experienced near misses effectively.
Yes, I think so. Very good question. Actually, so maybe it's easy to think about my own practice. This research actually improved my own practice as I hire people regularly in my team. I think there's this cliche about the idea that we want to ask people, tell me about your failure experience. And usually this traditionally has been a cliche in terms of thinking about, it seems like an interesting question to ask. But this data do tell us that these failure, and this is very important qualifier, is that people who manage to persevere after failure, and the failure could actually become a predictor for future success. So in this case, then, I sort of elevated the importance of failure, in terms of the interviewing process, is to think about specifically, be very serious of studying, ask candidates about their past failure experience and think about what are things they learned from that experience. So on one implication, yes, absolutely. I think this sort of changed my view about the importance of fail early in your career and sort of become a sort of predictor for future success. And there are many behavioral research that shows why it could be so, right? Is to think about this idea that failure may teach many valuable lessons that otherwise are difficult to learn. And so that's been very, very important. And another one that's, I think, equally interesting implication for me is to also think about how these results change my view about success. I recently had this experience with my student where she had a great paper published very early on in her career. But, when we publish a paper, we actually sit down and think about, are we narrow winners in this case? And how should we think about this winning? Because I feel like in my experience, what's interesting about narrow winners is that most narrow winners don't think they're narrow winners. But in reality, a lot of winning maybe just be split by a hair, and you're like maybe just lucky, a dumb lucky to be the side of the winning side. And so that, I think, also has implications to think about how do we internalize and conceptualize this winning to continue improve ourselves and not just become complacent.
Dashun, absolutely fascinating stuff. Is sort of just getting your head around it. But got some questions coming in. Terry wants to know: is there a link to developing more grit and persistence through experiencing failures?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question, and I think it relates to phenomenal work done by Angela Duckworth. I recommend the book Grit to everybody. In this research, we have not surveyed people in terms of their grit factors and their psychological factors. What we're observing is their sort of when they fail, how do they initiate another attempt? So in this respect, I think there are some things to learn around this research to think about how do we sort of fail more intelligently. I think a very important idea here is to think about the model in terms of taking into account past failure experiences. I think what's very important is to realize your past failure experience here give you experience as well as feedback. And what you want is to sort of try to make sure your eyes on the prize, try to update the components that didn't work so well, but keeping the ones that worked well. So in other words, you actually want to think about sort of managing incremental improvements so that you can retain what worked well, only updating those what doesn't work out. What's interesting about the failure group that we observed? In other words, the group that tried over and over but didn't achieve success, that group of people didn't work less. Actually, they work more. They're actually less efficient. What happened there is that they basically started from scratch, not learning enough from past experience. So I guess what's interesting here is to also think about this idea of work harder, work smarter but not harder. Sort of try to diagnose yourself how this is going. I think for managers it could also be relevant, because as a manager, this also gives us a tool of diagnose as we fail over and over how well we're doing. Are we in the stagnation region or are we in the progression region? So the key here, the mantra of Silicon Valley is to say fail fast. But I think the key here is to think about fail faster. It should not just fail fast, but needs to fail increasingly fast as an indication for your learning experience, your learning from failure.
I think Joel Mallard's got an interesting question. Do failures lead to a wider and more robust network of mentors and collaborators? I suppose I suppose narrow winners might think they don't need anyone else. They've got it cracked.
That is another fascinating question. I think this is actually an active area for research. I think it's very likely across all the theoretical frameworks that this is likely to happen. Some behavioral research suggests that when people fail, they enable wider search process. And that sort of is consistent with this idea you may be seeking out more advantageous mentors or collaborators. We don't yet have the evidence to show this yet, but I think this is sort of one of the many things that this research is enable us to next to look further into the data.
Okay, Margaret is asking, can you please provide the information on the website? We will post that at a later date. Stay posted, and I'm sure you'll be able to share that information also. But I think the interesting thing here is, if we're actually quantifying that we do indeed learn more from failure than we possibly do from success. But can you talk a little bit more about the two elements, experience and feedback? How do we know, how do these people that go on to then succeed, your number fours, if you like, how do they interpret the feedback? How do we avoid just making the same mistakes again and again?
Correct. So, and also like individuals will be able to infer differently from their past experience. And also some past experience, the feedback may be more ambiguous than others. And these are all excellent questions. And I think what we're taking here is a very simplistic approach, is to think about on average what might happen. And I think what's important here is to really think very carefully and strategically about your past experience. Like, for example, I experience failure as a daily basis, and that's part of why I feel like I have some expertise to study this and motivation to do so. But I think here is to every time I fail, I want to think back to what are the different components that I sort of included in this attempt, and what are the components that I do well or not based on the older feedback I can get, and then sort of try to diagnose myself to think about when I try again, what are the components I should try to retain, what are the components I should focus my energy and try to improve.
Yeah, a number of people have commented that if only the education system had access to your research and understanding of your research, because presumably that would fundamentally change the way we approach education.
I'm very delighted to hear that. I fully agree, but I think, these are all the new data that we're learning, and hopefully we'll be able to bring this to wider and wider audience. And also these audience and the different institutions can also help us stress test these results and test the generalizability of these results as well. We ourselves are working on the generalizability of these results, and we're seeing several very, very promising signals from ongoing work that this seems to be generalizable from different domains.
Dashun, there's a good point from Jyoti here saying our corporate performance systems are allergic to failure. I think we've somehow trained ourselves to make ourselves allergic to failure. How do we change that? Because it's a mindset thing, isn't it?
Yes, it is a mindset thing. I think one of the greatest thing I learned as a non-native speaker, first when I learned English, is that you say hello by saying how are you, and then the answer is uniformly fine, great, fantastic, awesome, cannot be better. In reality, no matter what you're going through. So this is baked in very clearly, not just in the corporate culture, but also just in the culture more generally. I think, this actually raises questions for, what should we do as an individual and what should we do as a manager? I think as an individual, to me, it's also been very educational, this own research. For individual, I think it's important to realize that reality is necessarily rosier than it really is. Everybody has a Facebook, you will understand, all your friends is either on the beach or some 5-star hotel, exotic place at all times, but that's not really what's happening. So we have to realize, the world is, all the rare successes are overrepresented in the world. For example, if you look at a LinkedIn or resume is completely conclusively composed of just successful experience. At the same time, the common failures are already underrepresented in the data, sometimes even forgotten or ignored. So I think what's for an individual is very important to think about these basically like selection bias in the data, and then think about how do you learn from these data that has inherently a very, very strong, substantial, and consequential selection biases. How do you learn from them and update your own prior? So as an individual, I think that to me, that's been very, very important point for me to think about how to conceptualize a success and failure.
Dashun, unfortunately, we're out of time. This is just a taster of Dashun Wang's fantastic research. Failure is such a fertile area. It's just amazing, isn't it? And it's universal, it's riveting, it's human, and I think the way you conceptualize it makes it very accessible and challenges a lot of very fundamental ideas. So thank you very much for joining us today. Check out Dashun's book, The Science of Science. There's no need for him to plug it again. It's okay. I've got that covered. And check out his website for all these details, dashunwang.com. Dashun, thank you very much for joining us, and thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again next week. Thank you.